Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Master of Hollow Grange by Sax Rohmer. Part 1. Jack Dillon came to Hollow Grange on a thunderous black evening when an ebony cloud crested the hilltop above, and catching the upflung rays of sunset, glowed redly like the pall of Avalon in the torchlight. Through the dense ranks of firs cloaking the slopes, a breeze, presaging the coming storm, whispered evilly, and here in the hollows the birds were still. The man who had driven him from the station glanced at him with a curiosity thinly veiled. "What about your things, sir?" he inquired. Dillon stared rather blankly at the ivy-covered lodge, which, if appearance were to be trusted, was unoccupied. "Wait a moment, I will ring," he said curtly, for this furtive curiosity, so ill-concealed, had manifested itself in the manner of the taxi-driver from the moment that Dillon had directed him to drive to Hollow Grange. He pushed open the gate and tugged at the iron ring which was suspended from the wall of the lodge. A discordant clangor rewarded his efforts, the cracked note of a bell that spoke from somewhere high up in the building, that seemed to be buffeted to and fro from fir to fir until it died away mournfully in some place of shadows far up the slope. In the voice of the bell there was something furtive, something akin to the half-veiled curiosity in the eyes of the man who stood watching him, something fearful too in both, as though man and bell would whisper, "Return, beware of disturbing the dwellers in this place." But Dillon angrily recalled himself to the realities. He felt that these ghostly imaginings were born of the maltreated flesh, were products of lower tone, that he would have perceived no query in the glance of the taxi-driver, and heard no monkish whisper in the clang of the bell, had he been fit, had he been fully recovered from the effects of his wound. Monkish whisper? Yes, that was it. His mind had supplied automatically an aptly descriptive term. The cracked bell spoke with the voice of ancient monasteries, had in it the hush of cloisters and the sigh of renunciation. "Hang it all," muttered Dillon. "This won't do." A second time he awoke the ghostly bell voice, but nothing responded to its call. Man, bird, and beast had seemingly deserted Hollow Grange. He was conscious of a sudden nervous irritation as he turned brusquely and met the inquiring face of the taxi-man. "I have arrived before I was expected," he said. "If you will put my things in the porch here, I will go up to the house and get a servant to fetch them. They will be safe enough in the meantime." His own words increased his irritability, for they were not in the nature of an apology on behalf of his silent and unseen host. Were they not a concession to that nameless query in the man's stare? Moreover, deep within his own consciousness, something vague was stirring, so that the man dismissed and promptly departed. Dillon stood glancing from the little stack of baggage in the lodge porch, up the gloomy, narrow, and overarched drive, aware that he had also carried a question in his eyes. The throb of the motor mounting the steep, winding lane grew dim, and more dim until it was borne away entirely upon the fitful breeze. Faintly he detected the lowing of cattle in some distant pasture. The ranks of firs whispered secretly one to another, and the pall above the hills grew blacker and began to extend over the valley. Amid that ominous stillness of nature, he began to ascend the cone-strewn path. Evidently enough, the extensive grounds had been neglected for years, and that few pedestrians and fewer vehicles ever sought Hollow Grange was demonstrated by the presence of luxuriant weeds in the carriageway. Having proceeded for some distance until the sheer hillside seemed to loom over him like the wall of a tower, Dillon paused, peering about in the ever-glowing darkness. He was aware of a physical chill, Certainly no ray of sunlight ever penetrated to this tunnel through the firs. Could he have mistaken the path and be proceeding not toward the house, but away from it and into the midnight of the woods mantling the hills? There was something uncomfortable in that reflection. Momentarily he knew a childish fear of the darkening woods, and walked forward rapidly, self-assertively. 10 paces brought him to one of the many bends in the winding road, and there, far ahead, as though out of some cavern in the very hillside, a yellow light shone. He pressed on with greater assurance until the house became visible. Now he perceived that he had indeed strayed from the carriage sweep in some way, for the path that he was following terminated at the foot of a short flight of moss-covered brick steps. He mounted the steps and found himself at the bottom of a terrace. The main entrance was far to his left, and separated from the terrace by a neglected lawn. That portion of the place was Hanoverian and ugly, while the wing nearest to him was Tudor and picturesque. Excepting the yellow light shining out from a sunken window almost at his feet, no illuminations were visible about the house, although the brewing storm had already plunged the hollow into premature night. Indeed, there was no sign of occupancy about the strange-looking mansion, which might have hidden forgotten for centuries in the horseshoe of the hills. He had sought for rest and quiet. Here he should find them. The stillness of the place was of that sort which almost seems to be palpable, that can be seen and felt. A humid chill arose apparently from the terrace, with its stone pavings outlined in moss, crept up from the wilderness below and down from the fir woods above. A thought struggled to assume form in his mind. There was something reminiscent about this house of the woods, this silent house which struck no chord of human companionship, in which was no warmth of life or love. Suddenly the thought leapt into complete being. This was the place of the sleeping beauty to which he had penetrated. It was a fairy tale dear to childhood, which had been struggling for expression in his mind ever since he had emerged from the trees onto the desolate terrace. With the departure of the station cab had gone the last link with today, and now he was translated to the goblin realm of fable. He had crossed the terrace and the lawn, and stood looking through an open French window into a room that evidently adjoined the hall. A great still darkness had come, and on a little table in the room a reading lamp was burning. It had a quaint mosaic shade, which shut in much of the light, but threw a luminous patch directly on a heap of cushions strewn upon the floor. Face downward in the silken nest, her chin resting upon her hands, and her elfin curly brown hair tousled bewitchingly, lay a girl so audaciously pretty that Dillon hesitated to accept the evidence of his eyes. The crunching of a piece of gravel beneath his foot led to the awakening of the sleeping beauty. She raised her head quickly, and then started upright. A lithe, divinely petite figure in a green velvet dress, having short, fur-trimmed sleeves that displayed her pretty arms. For an instant it was a startled nymph that confronted him. Then a distracting dimple appeared in one fair cheek, and "Oh, how you frightened me," said the girl, speaking with a slight French accent, which the visitor found wholly entrancing. "You must be Jack Dillon." "I am Fern." Dillon bowed. "Oh, how I envy Hyperides," he said. A blush quickly stained the lovely face of Fern, and the roguish eyes were lowered, whereby the penitent Dillon, who had jested in not the uncoming belief that a pretty girl is necessarily brainless, knew that the story of the Wonder Woman of Thesby was familiar to her modern namesake. "I'm afraid," declared Fern, with a return of her mischievous composure, "that you are very wicked." Dillon, who counted himself a man of the world, was temporarily at a loss for a suitable rejoinder. The cause of his hesitancy was twofold. In the first place, he had reached the age of disillusionment, whereat a man ceases to believe that a perfectly lovely woman exists in the flesh, and in the second place, he had found such a fabulous being in a house of gloom and silence, to which a few moments ago he had deeply regretted having come. His father, who had accepted the invitation from an old college friend on his son's behalf, had made no mention of a Fern, whereas Fern clearly took herself for granted and evidently knew all about Jack Dillon. The latter experienced a volcanic change of sentiment. Hollow Grange was metamorphosed and assumed magically the guise of a golden house, an emperor's pleasure palace, a fair, old-world casket holding this lovely jewel. But who was she? And in what spirit should he receive her bewildering coquetries? I trust, he said, looking into the laughing eyes, that you will learn to know me better. Fern curtsied mockingly. You have either too much confidence in your own character or not enough in my wisdom, she said. Dillon stepped into the room and, stooping, took up a book which lay open upon the book. It was a French edition of the Golden Ass of Apulus. The hollow was illuminated by a blinding flash of lightning, and Fern's musical laughter was drowned in the thunder that boomed and crashed in deepening peals over the hills. In a sudden tropical torrent the rain descended as Dr. Casimir entered the room. Part 2. Jack Dillon leaned from his open window and looked out over the valley to where a dull red glow crowned the hilltop. There was a fire somewhere in the neighborhood of the distant town. Probably a building had been struck by lightning. The storm had passed, although thunder was still audibly dimly, like the roll of a muffled drums or a remote bombardment. Stillness had reclaimed Hollow Grange. He was restless, uneasy. He sought to collate his impressions of the place and its master. 12 years had elapsed since his one previous meeting with Dr. Casimir, and little or no memory of the man had remained. So much had intervened, the war and Fern. Now that he was alone and could collect his ideas, he knew of what Dr. Casimir's gaunt, wide-eyed face had reminded him. It was of Thoth, the ibis-headed god, whose figure he had seen on the walls of the temples during his service in Egypt. Casimir was always a queer fish, Jack, his father had said, but most of his eccentricities were due to his passion for study. The Grange is the very place Sir Francis, the specialist, would have chosen for your convalescence, and you'll find nothing dangerously exciting in Casimir's atmosphere. Yet there was that about Dr. Casimir which he did not and could not like. His quietly cordial welcome, his courteous regret that his guest's arrival by an earlier train, a circumstance due to reduced service, had led to his not being met at the station, the charming simplicity with which he confessed to the smallness of his household, and to the pleasure which it afforded him to have the son of an old chum beneath his roof. All these kindly overtures had left the bird-like eyes cold, hard, watchful, calculating. The voice was the voice of a friend and a gentleman, but the face was the face of Thoth. The mystery of Fern was solved in a measure. She was Dr. Casimir's adopted daughter, and the orphan child of Louis Devant, the famous Paris cartoonist who had died penniless in 1911 at the height of his success. In his selection of a name for her, the brilliant and dissolute artist had exhibited a breadth of mind which Fern inherited in an almost embarrassing degree. Their mental equipment was bewildering, the erudition of an Oxford don, spiced with more than a dash of Bull Mitch, which made for complexity. Her curious learning was doubtless due to the setting of a receptive mind amid such environment. But how she had retained her piquant vivacity in Hollow Grange was less comprehensible. The servants formed a small and saturnine company. Only two, the housekeeper, Mrs. Harmon, a black and forbidding figure, and Madame Charney, a French companion, sleeping in the house. Golly, a surly creature who neglected the gardens and muttered savagely over other duties, together with his wife who cooked, resided at the lodge. There were two maids who lived in the village. The glow from the distant fire seemed to be reflected upon the firs bordering the terrace below. Then Dillon, watching the dull red light, remembered that Dr. Casimir's laboratory adjoined the tiny chapel, and that though midnight drew near, the doctor was still at work there. Owls and other night birds hooted and shrieked among the trees, and many bats were in flight. He found himself thinking of the pyramid bats of Egypt, and of the ibis-headed Thoth, who was the scribe of the underworld. Dr. Casimir had made himself medically responsible for his case, and had read attentively the letters which Dillon had brought from his own physician. He was to prescribe on the following day, and tonight the visitor found Morpheus, a treacherous god. Furtive activities disturbed the house, or so it seemed to the sleepless man, tossing on his bed. Alert intelligence within Hollow Grange responded to the nightlife of the owls without, and he seemed to lie in the shadow of a watchfulness that never slumbered. Part 3. There's many a fine walk hereabouts, said the old man seated in an armchair in the corner of the Thresher's Inn bar parlor. Dillon nodded encouragingly. There's Ganton on the hill, continued the agent. You can see the sea from there in clear weather, and many's the time I've heard the guns in France from Upper Crowberry of a still night. Then 4 miles away there's the haunted Grange, though nobody's allowed past the gate. Not as nobody wants to be, he added reflectively. The haunted Grange? Questioned Dillon. Where is that? Hollow Grange, said the old man. Why, it lies. Oh, Hollow Grange, yes. I know where Hollow Grange is, but I wasn't aware that it was reputed to be haunted. Ah, replied the other pityingly. You're new to these parts. I see that the minute I set eyes on you. Maybe you was wounded in France, and you're down here to get well, like? Quite so. Your deductive reasoning is admirable. Ah, said the sage, chuckling with self-appreciation. I ain't lived in these here parts for nigh on 75 years without learning to use my eyes. I ain't. For 74 years and 7 months, he added proudly. I ain't been outside this here county where I was born, and I can use my eyes, I can. I know a thing I do when I see it. Maybe it was Providence, as you might say, what brought you to the Threshers today. Quite possibly, Dillon admitted. He was just such another as you, continued the old man with apparent irrelevance. You don't happen to be stopping at Hannigam's vicarage? No, replied Dillon. Ah, he was stopping at Hanniham vicarage. He'd been wounded in France. How he got to know Dr. Casimir, I can't tell you. Not at Parson's, anyway. Parson won't never speak to him. Only last Sunday week he preached against him. Not in so many words, but I could see his drift. He spoke about them heathen women living on an island, sort of female Robinson Crusoes. I make him out, I do, as saves poor shipwrecked sailors from the sea and strangles them ashore. Dillon glanced hard at the voluble old man. The sirens? He suggested, conscious of a sudden hot surging about his heart. Ah, that's the women I mean. But where's the connection? Oh, you're new to these parts, you are. That Dr. Casimir, he keeps the siren down in Hollow Grange. They see her. These here strangers. Same as the shipwrecked sailors Parson told about. And it's all up with 'em. Dillon stifled a laugh, in which anger would have mingled with contempt. To think that in the 20th century a man of science was like to meet with the fate of Dr. Dee and the days of Elizabeth. Truly there were dark spots in England. But could he credit the statement of this benighted elder that a modern clergyman had actually drawn an analogy between Fern Devant and the sirens? It was unbelievable. What was the unhappy fate, he asked, masking his intolerance, of the young man staying at the vicarage? The same as them before him, came the startlingly reply. For he weren't the first, and maybe, with a shrewd glance of the rheumy old eyes, he won't be the last. Them sirens has the powers of darkness. I know, 'cause I've seen one, her at the Grange, and though I'm an old man, 975, I'll never forget her face, I won't, and the way she smiled at me. But, persisted Dillon patiently, what became of this particular young man, the one who was staying at the vicarage? The ancient sage leant forward in his chair and tapped the speaker upon the knee with the stem of his clay pipe. Ask them as knows, he said with impressive solemnity. Nobody else can tell you. And having permitted an indiscreet laugh to escape him, not another word on the subject could Dillon induce the old man to utter. He strictly confined himself in his ruffled dignity to the climatic conditions and the crops. When Dylan finally set out upon the 4-mile walk back to the Grange, he realized with annoyance that the senile imaginings of his bar parlor acquaintance lingered in his mind. That Dr. Casimir dwelt outside the social life of the county he had speedily learned, but for this he had been prepared. That he might possibly be not a recluse, but a pariah, was a new point of view. Trivial things to which hitherto he had paid scant attention began to marshal themselves as evidence. The 2 village helpers, he knew, received extravagant wages, because, as Fern had confessed, they had found it almost impossible to get girls to stay. Why? Of the earlier guests who had succumbed to the siren lure of Fern, he had heard no mention. Why? Save at mealtimes he rarely saw his host, who frankly left him to the society of Fern. Again, why? Dr. Casimir in his jealously locked laboratory was at work day and night upon his experiments. What were these experiments? What was the nature of the doctor's studies? He had now been for nearly 3 weeks at Hollow Grange, and never had Dr. Casimir spoken of his work. And Fern? The sudden new thought of Fern was so strange, so wonderful and overwhelming, that it reacted physically, and he pulled up short in the middle of a field path, as though some palpable obstacle blocked the way. Why had he set out alone that day, when all other days had been spent in the girl's company? He had deliberately sought solitude. Because of Fern. Because he wanted to think calmly, judiciously, to rein himself before his own judgment, remote from the witchery of her presence. He had tried to render his mind a void, wherein should linger not one fragrant memory of her delicate beauty and charm, so that he might return unbiased to his judgment. He had returned. He was judged. He loved Fern, madly and sanely. His future, his life, lay in the hollow of her hands. Part 4. Yes, admitted Fern, it is true. There were 2 of them. And Dylan hesitated. Were they in love with you? Of course, said Fern naively. But you? Fern shook her curly head. I rather like the French boys. But I do not believe anything that a Frenchman says to a girl. And Harry, the other, was handsome but so silly. So, you did not love either of them? Of course not. But, said Dylan, and impulsively he swept her into his arms, you are going to love me. One quick upward glance she gave, but instantly lowered her eyes and withheld her bewitching face from him. Am I? She whispered. You are so conceited. But as she spoke the words he kissed her, and she surrendered sweetly, nestling her head against his shoulder for a moment. Then leaping back, bright-eyed and blushing, she turned and ran like a startled fawn across the terrace and into the house. He saw no more of her until dinner time, and spent the interval in a kind of suspended consciousness that was new and perturbing. Within him life pulsed at delirious speed, but the universe seemed to have slowed upon its course, so that each hour became as 2. Throughout dinner Fern was deliciously shy to the point of embarrassment, and Dylan, who several times surprised the bird eyes of Dr. Casimir, studying the girl's face, detained his host, and being a young man of orderly mind, formally asked his consent to an engagement. The doctor's joy was seemingly so unfeigned that Dylan almost liked him for a moment. He placed no obstacle in the path of the suitor for his adopted daughter's hand, graciously expressing every confidence in the future. His joy was genuine enough, Dylan determined, but from what source did it actually spring? The Toff-like eyes were exultant, and all the old mistrust poured back in a wave upon the young man. Was this distrust becoming an obsession? Why should he eternally be seeking an ulterior motive for every act in this man's life? He went to look for Fern, and found her in the spot where he had first seen her, prone in a nest of cushions. She sprang up as he entered the room, and glanced at him in that new way which set his heart leaping. And because of the magic of her presence, it was not until later, when he stood alone in his own room, that he could order the facts gleaned from her. There was some grain of truth in the story of the ancient gossip at the threshery, after all. A young French lieutenant of artillery had received an invitation to spend a leave at Hollow Grange. His Gallic soul had been fired by Fern's beauty, and although his advances had been met with rebuff, he had asked Dr. Casimir's permission to pay his court to the girl. The same evening he had departed hurriedly, and Fern had supposed, since the doctor never referred to him again, that he had been sent about his business. Then came a strange letter, which Fern had shown to Dillon. Its tone throughout was of passionate anger, and one passage recurred again and again to Dillon's mind. "I would give my life for you gladly," it read, "but my soul belongs to God." Fern had counted him demented, and Dr. Casimir had agreed with her. But there was Harry Wainwright, the nephew of the vicar of St. Peter's at Hanningham. An accidental meeting with Fern had led to a courtesy call, and the inevitable. It had all the seeming of a case of love-sickness, and the unhappy youth grew seriously ill. From pestering her daily he changed his tactics to studiously avoiding her until, meeting her in the village one morning, he greeted her with, "I can't do it, Fern. Tell him I can't do it. He can rely upon my word, but I'm going away to try to forget." Dr. Casimir had professed entire ignorance by the meaning of the words. A faint shadow had crossed Fern's face as she spoke of these matters, but as a result of her extraordinary beauty, she was somewhat callous where languishing admirers were concerned, and she had dismissed the gloomy twain with a shrug of her charming shoulders. "Mad," she had said. "It seems my fate always to meet madmen." The night's silence had descended again upon Hollow Grange, disturbed only by the mournful cry of the owl and the almost imperceptible note of the bat. But to the nervous alertness of Dillon, a deep unrest seemed to stir within the house yet. An unrest not physical but spiritual. It was as the shadow of a sleepless watcher, a shadow creeping over his soul. What was the explanation lying at the back of it all? Vainly he sought for theory, however wild, however improbable, that should embrace all the facts known to him, and serve either to banish his black doubts or to focus them. Upon one thing he had determined. There was something or someone in Hollow Grange that he feared, some center from whence fear radiated. Fern, for one fleeting moment, had revealed to him that she too had known this formless dread, but only latterly, probably from lack of a more definite date. She had spoken of this fear at first visiting her at about the time of the Frenchman's advent. "Slowly he has changed towards me," she had whispered, referring to Dr. Casimir. "He watches me, sometimes in a strange way. Oh, he has been so good, so very kind and good, but I shall be glad when—" Could some part of the mystery be explained away by the doctor's increasing absorption in his studies, which led him to regard the charge of a ward, and a wayward one at that, as unduly onerous and disturbing? Might it not be fair to suppose that ignorant superstition and the ravings of unrequited passion accounted for the rest? At the nature of Dr. Casimir's studies he could not even guess. The greater number of the works in the library related to mysticism in one form or another, although there was a sprinkling of exact science to leaven the whole. "He can rely upon my word," Wainwright had said. Regarding what? Or regarding whom had he given his word? The cry of a nighthawk came as if in answer, the hoot of an owl as if in mockery. Out beyond the terrace a dull red light showed from Dr. Casimir's laboratory. Part 5. Enlightenment came about in this fashion. Seeking to quench a feverish thirst, Dillon discovered that no glass had been left in his room. He determined to fetch one from the buffet cupboard downstairs. Softly and slippered feet, he descended the stairs and was crossing the hallway when he kicked something. A small book, he thought, that lay upon the floor. Groping, he found it, slipped it into the pocket of his dressing gown, and entered the dining room. He found a tumbler without difficulty, in the dark, noted the presence of a heavy oppressive odor, and returned upstairs. Now he made another discovery. He had forgotten the nightly draught of medicine prescribed by Dr. Casimir. A new unopened phial stood upon the dressing-table. He mixed himself a mild whiskey and soda from the decanter and siphon which his host's hospitality caused nightly to be placed in his room, and then, seized by a sudden thought, took out the little book which he had found in the hall. It was a faded manuscript in monkish Latin, a copy of an unpublished work of Paracelsus. Many passages had been rendered into English, and the translations, in Dr. Casimir's minute-cramped writing, were interposed between the bound pages, and these again were interpolated marginal notes, some in the shape of unintelligible symbols, other in that of chemical formulae. Several passages were marked in red ink, and having perused the first of these which he chanced upon, a clammy moisture broke out upon his skin, accompanied by so marked a nervous trembling that he was forced to seat himself upon the bed. The secret of this man's ghastly life work was in his hands. He knew now what bargain Dr. Casimir had proposed to the Frenchman and to the other. He knew why he had adopted the lovely daughter of Louis Devant, and he knew why he, Jack Dillon, had been invited to Hollow Grange. That such a ghoul in human shape could live and have his being amid ordinary mankind was a stupendous improbability which 10 minutes earlier he would have laughed to scorn. My God, he whispered. My God. His glance fell upon the unopened phial on his dressing table, and from his soul a silent thanksgiving rose to heaven that he had left that potion untasted. He realized that his own case differed from those of his predecessors in two particulars. He was actually in residence under Casimir's roof and receiving treatment from the man's hand. No option was to be offered to him. The great experiment, the magnum opus, was to be performed without his consent. And Fern, the other innocent victim of this fiend's lust for knowledge. The thought restored his courage. More than life itself depended upon his coolness and address. He must act at once. The monstrous possibility hinted at by Hohenheim in his earliest published book, Practica di Theophasti Paracelsi, printed at Augsburg in 1529, was, in this hideous pamphlet, elaborated and brought within the bounds of practical experiment. He crept to the door, opened it, and stood listening intently. That silence which seemed like a palpable cloud, a cloud masking the presence of one who watched, lay over the house. Slowly he descended to the hall and dropped the horror which the evil genius of von Hohenheim had conceived upon the spot where it had lain when his foot had discovered it. A creaking sound warned him of someone's approach, and he had barely time to slip behind some draperies ere a cowled figure bearing a lantern came out into the hall. It was Dr. Casimir, wearing a loose gown, having a monkish hood, and he was searching for something. Nothing in his experience, not the bloodlust seen in the eyes of men in battle, had prepared him for that which transfigured the face of Dr. Casimir. The strange semblance of Thoth was there no more. It had given place to another more active malevolence, to a sort of satanic eagerness indescribably terrifying. It was the face of one possessed. Like some bird of prey, he pounced upon the book, thrust it into the pocket of his gown, and began furtively to retrace his steps. As he entered the big dining room, Dillon was close upon his heels. Dr. Casimir passed into the small room beyond, and turned from thence into the library. Dillon, observing every precaution, followed. From the library the doctor entered the short, narrow passage leading to that quaint relic of bygone days and ways, the tiny chapel. At the entrance Dillon paused, watchful. Once the man in the monkish robe turned, on the time-worn step of the altar, and looked back over his shoulder, revealing a face that might well have been that of Amadeus himself. On the left of the altar was the cupboard where no doubt in past ages the priest had kept his vestments. The oppressive odor which Dillon had first observed in the dining room was very perceptible in the chapel, and as Dr. Casimir opened the door of the cupboard and stepped within, an explanation of the presence of this deathly smell in the house occurred to Dillon's mind. The laboratory adjoined the Grange on this side. Here was a private entrance known to and used by Dr. Casimir alone. His surmise proved to be correct. Occasionally, scarcely a sound, the secret door opened, and a fiery glow leapt out across the altar steps. accompanied by a wave of heated air laden with a nauseous, unnameable smell. Within the redly lighted doorway, Dr. Casimir paused and glanced at a watch which he wore upon his wrist. Then for a moment he disappeared, to reappear carrying a small, squat bottle and a contrivance of wire and gauze, the sight of which created in Dillon a sense of physical nausea. It was a chloroform mask. Both he placed upon a vaguely seen table and again approached the door. Weakly Dillon fell back, pressing himself closely against the chapel wall, as the doctor, this time leaving the secret entrance open with a purpose in view which the watchers shudderingly recognized, recrossed the chapel and went off, softly treading in the direction of the library. All his courage, moral and physical, was called upon now, and knowing by some intuition of love what and whom he should find there, he stepped unsteadily into Dr. Casimir's laboratory. That there were horrors, monstrosities that may not be described, whose name may not be written, in the place he realized, in some subconscious fashion, but prone upon a low metal couch of most curious workmanship lay Fern, in her night robe, still, white, perfect in her pale beauty, as her namesake who posed for Paraxteles. Dillon reeled, steadied himself, and sank upon his knees by the couch. Fern, he whispered, locking his arms about her. My Fern. Then he remembered the gauze mask, and even detected the sickly sweet smell of the anesthetic. Anger gave him new strength. He raised the girl in his arms and turned toward the door communicating with the chapel. Framed in the opening was the hooded figure of Dr. Casimir. Confronting him, his face was immobile again, with the immobility of ibis-headed Thoth. His eyes were hard. His voice was cold. What is the meaning of this outrage? He demanded sternly. Fern has been taken suddenly ill. An immediate operation may be necessary. Out of my way, said Dillon, advancing past a huge glass jar filled with reddish liquid that stood upon a pedestal between the couch and the door. Be careful, you fool, shrieked Dr. Casimir, frenziedly, his calm dropping from him like a cloak, and a new and dreadful light coming into the staring eyes. But he was too late. Dillon's foot had caught the pedestal. With a resounding crash, the thing overturned. As Dr. Casimir sprang forward, he slipped in the slimy stream that was pouring over the laboratory floor, and fell. Laying Fern upon the altar, her head resting against the age-worn communion rails, Dillon returned and closed the secret door dividing the house of God from the house of Satan. One glimpse in the red furnace glow he had of Dr. Casimir writhing upon the slimy floor, shrieking and blaspheming, and fighting madly as a man fights for life and more than life. He had not yet carried the unconscious girl beyond the dining room, when, above that other smell, he detected the odor of burning wood. A fire had broken out in the laboratory. Mrs. Jack Dillon mourns her guardian, no trace of whom was ever found in the charred remains of Hollow Grange, to this day, for she retains no memory of the night of the great fire, but believes that, overcome by the fumes, she was rescued and carried insensible from the house by her lover. In the latter's bosom the grim secret is locked, with the memory of a demonic figure fighting, fighting.